like to start my first question to President Nakao. President Nakao, Asia and the Pacific is home to 44% of the world's urban population. I was wondering, from your perspective, what do you see as the main trends of development, urbanization development in Asia? And at the same time, what are the main challenges that the region is facing with regards to creating livable cities?
Thank you very much. As you mentioned, Asia is a home to about half of urban population in the world, and it was only 20% of the total population in 1970. So today, about again 47% of Asian population, developing Asian countries' population, living in cities. In the coming years, it will be up to 70%. So cities are the place for productions and productivity. In a sense, the city is a more productive, efficient place to produce things. We are now writing a book of Asian development history, and one of the sections is about the transformation from agriculture to industry and service. So together with this transformation by sectors, the urbanization is also deepening in Asia and in other regions. Why is that? Because from agriculture to industry means already urbanization, and then service sector. So urbanization is happening in many countries, and also it's once again the efficient place to produce things because of what we call agglomeration effect, in which people can live closer each other, and they can exchange views very quickly. There are kind of concentrations of certain knowledge in certain part of the cities. So agglomeration impact is clear. So it is productive. But at the same time, we must worry about several things, or we must pay attention to several things. One is, of course, congestion and pollution. So it's very clear that in many megacities in Asia, including Manila, where we are headquarters, congestion is becoming more, serious, and many people spend 2 hours just to go to the office and come back to the home. So it is economic impact is negative impact is very clear, and in addition, in a sense, it is taking away the precious time of people who otherwise can spend with family or can be doing more productive things. Of course, some people do listen to the Economist magazine's articles by hearing, but it's not really best way to look at the articles. So that is one. Congestion and pollution is becoming very serious, and in many cities in Asia, including Delhi and Beijing, it is becoming a social issue. So we are supporting those issues. For instance, in Beijing, Greater Beijing area, capital areas, we are supporting air pollution control by using policy-based lending based on the several policy metrics, including legal actions and frameworks and so on, and also result-based lending to support factories become cleaner, and also project-based lending. And in another example in China is ecological development in Yangtze River areas, which is also a center for, or the place for mega cities, including Shanghai. So we are supporting it. So once again, congestion and also the density of transport, we are supporting public transport. Pollution. And then another issue is we should have a kind of the equality, inclusive growth in the cities. So how to make cities more inclusive and to keep the difference of living standard between people in the cities less is also a challenge. So public education, public health, and conditioned cash transfer and so on is also needed. And another point I want to mention is after when we are writing the book, we shouldn't be, what I said is we shouldn't be triumphant that the city is a place for production or efficiency, because cities are supported by rural surrounding rural regions. So we need to pay attention to good connectivity between the surrounding rural part and the city. So that is another element we must pay attention. So finally, when we look at the cities, we must also again look at the cities in the rural areas, not just the urban areas. And in that, we should also think about how to make cities more compact so that the social service is more easy to provide. So we shouldn't look at just making cities bigger, but we should make cities compact, including surrounding rural areas.
Thank you, President Nakao. President Adesina, Africa has seen a very important increase in urban population over the past 2 decades. What would you say are the perspectives in cities in Africa in the near future?
Well, first and foremost, let me thank my dear brother, Luis Moreno, for hosting us here at the Inter-American Development Bank, and thank all the partners, all of our institutions for having worked together on this very important project. The very fact that we call it Creating Livable Cities tells me that the cities are not livable. If you take a look at Africa, for example, sorry for my voice and got a bit of cold coming in from Iowa, so you can understand. But if you look at Africa today, it accounts for 25% of the 100 fastest growing cities in the world. You look at some of them, pick where I come from in Nigeria, Lagos, for example. You take Kinshasa in Democratic Republic of Congo, or you take Cairo. Those cities alone account for 10 million people. And there are 52 cities that have population of above 1 million people. As President Nakao was just saying, the urbanization rate in Africa, it's incredible. It's 4%. It's double that of the global average, right? And so what you're really finding is that he just made a last point there about the rural and the urban connection. People are emptying out of rural areas because they can't find economic opportunities, and so they are going to cities. And so essentially what you find is urbanization in Africa, it's not an organized city development. It's not an organized urbanization process. It is people escaping from the lack of good livelihoods in rural areas and basically going to cities, hoping that they're going to find something. Of course, they find something because they have they can't find jobs in the city. So what you find then is just places where you have slums. We have in Africa today, 60% of all those that are living in the cities are not living in livable cities. They are actually living miserable lives in those cities because 60% of them are actually living in slums. Now, I remember about 3 years ago, there was a discussion with UN Habitat at the UN when I said, well, you can upgrade the slums if you want. But who wants to live in an upgraded slum? There are no 5-star slums. A slum is a slum. Because 60% of people that are basically living in slums, and that's not something we could do. Secondly, it's that when you look at cities in the advanced countries are also basically economic growth poles. People move there because it's the economic engine. But in Africa, people move to cities because they just want a place to stay. And so we are seeing this particular case. And so if I compare Africa, for example, to developed countries, you will find that for us, cities account for only about 55% of the GDP of African countries. In developed countries, it's over 90% of that. And so the whole issue of how cities develop, the economic potential, economic growth of cities, for me, I think it's really very crucial as we look at cities. Now, having said that, the question is, what do we do? What are the challenges that we find there? Lack of energy. We was talking about transport, congestion, pollution. You find in a lot of cities high level of crime because you can't find jobs in these particular cities. You also have problems of water and sanitation just because of the density of movement. You don't have the infrastructure base to support, quality life, if one could say that, in those cities. And so for us at the African Development Bank, we have been investing quite a lot in this particular area. May I just mention about a few of those areas. First is just to make sure people can have places to stay. Today, if you take Ghana, if you take Kenya, they have, in terms of mortgage finance, only about a deficit of about 2 million units. And it gets worse in Tanzania and other places, right? So the first thing is being able to have access to mortgage finance so that people can have quality housing in the cities. And so we are supporting quite a lot of that right now at the African Development Bank, including supporting what's called Shelter Afrique, which is the the organization we set up to support affordable housing, not just for the rich, but for the poor in the cities. The second one, of course, is what happens to transport. If you can't get from one place to the other, whether it's green or not, I don't care, but you just need to be able to get around, And so we are investing quite a lot. For example, if I take Tanzania, we did something called the Bus Rapid Transport System that is allowing us in Tanzania, and our director for that, it's actually Umaru is here, it's allowing us to support about 1.2 million people in terms of mass transit systems that is helping people mobility and productivity in the urban area. We supported, for example, in one of my great projects is in Senegal. We have a project called, it's a speed train. It's a regional express train that actually helps to decongest the city of Dakar, which is very important. Plus, it has, reduction of pollution as well, which is also very, very important. In Cote d'Ivoire, where we are as a headquarters of the bank, we've invested heavily in helping them with, infrastructure to decongest the city itself. So I think efficient transport system is very important to have a livable city. Mass transit is going to be very, very important. Other one that we are doing, of course, is water and sanitation. If you live in a place in which every time it rains, there's no, there's no drainage, there's nothing. That's a miserable way to live in the city. And so we are investing over the last, maybe from about 2015 to 2018, we've invested well over $2.7 billion in providing water and sanitation and hygiene to support cities that are in Africa. And finally, let me just say something with regard to how you finance cities themselves. I think cities, municipalities, and towns have to find a way in which they are able to finance themselves. That they don't just depend on the national governments. And so we think that we just launched a program to be able to finance cities, municipalities, and so on to do the upgrades that they need. So I think municipal bonds, green bonds, and those kind of things are very important to be able to finance cities. And finally, it's how we plan cities. And I'm hoping that even from learning from some of my colleagues here, where you have perhaps even higher levels of urbanization in what you're doing, what's the best way? What are the best lessons of planning cities that people want to live in? Because obviously, if you have a city, but nobody wants to live in it, that's a terrible city you have. And I think we all recognize that we must have green cities. We must have cities that are places that people can get jobs for. We must have cities that are resilient cities, if I may say that. And I think it's an exciting topic, and we look forward to learning more from the rest of the colleagues here. Thank you.
Thank you, President Adesina. President Moreno, Latin America and the Caribbean is the most urbanized developing region of the world. How would you define the cities in our region?
Well, first of all, thank you, Tatiana, and thank you to my colleagues for being here. I think this is a great exercise that we do collectively. Clearly, the fact that we can, given the depth of knowledge that each one has in the different regions, I think is not only great for our staffs to work together, to share notes, but equally to see the differences of different moments of development in our own regions. And I think this is what's absolutely fascinating. And as I say that, and you mentioned that we are the most urbanized region of the emerging world, it wasn't such 60 years ago when the bank was founded. At the time, a little less than 50% of Latin Americans live in cities. And today that number, as you well know, is way above 80%. And in the process, we saw many of the things that both Aki and Takehiko were mentioning. First of all, why was it that you had this huge push of migration to the cities? Fundamentally, it was about economic opportunity or the belief of economic opportunity. And so people moved away from rural areas to the cities because of lack of productivity in agriculture. Agriculture was losing gradually its own weight in the total GDP of countries. And so people went with this false dilemma that if they arrive in the cities, they will get industrial jobs, they will get better jobs, only to find themselves very much in the way that Aki was describing what he says today in Africa. And that really set back the productivity of cities in Latin America in a very big way. You know, you go to cities like Rio, and it's very unique in the case of Rio because the favelas of Rio have been for more than 100 years. It has to do more with the colonization process that took place there. But there's many places around Latin America where you had these pockets of poverty that remain so, and it takes a very long time to do the changes that you need that have to be, on the one hand, accompanied with whatever economic growth and opportunity is being built, with cities that have tremendous fiscal challenges, because when you have this huge push of people coming into cities, you don't have the level of taxation, you don't have the capacity of governments at the time to transfer enough resources. And the bulk of what happens in cities, as Takehiko mentioned very well, is the issues of mobility and the issues of the quality of housing. That, over the years, has been changing in Latin America, but we're still a long ways from there. And we have today, largely because of that, probably some of the largest megacities in the world. We have over 6 megacities. And when I say megacities, are cities defined by more than 10 million in population. And these cities, today, if you just look at productivity, going back to Takehiko's point, the productivity of those cities is basically flattened. And there's a number of reports that have pointed to that. McKinsey had a very interesting report about this. Then you have the other issues of climate change. You know, there's huge possibilities of what can be done around climate change in the ways of the efficiencies that you can introduce through the better use of capture of methane gas if it's in the case of landfills, what you can do in the way of a reduction of emissions through water systems and or energy systems. But these are all very heavy loads on cities. And then how do you begin to introduce a mobility that can be more efficient? And today it's wonderful to see some of the cities of Latin America, what's happening. Santiago de Chile, for instance, is revamping entirely its bus system to electric buses. The city of Bogota is following. Last week we were with many of my colleagues in Sao Paulo. There's over 14,000 buses there, and we were looking at a program to help, you know, decarbonize the city. And one of the ways of decarbonizing is moving away from, you know, fossil fuel related transport systems to electric. And equally, what can be done with lighting. And so I think this is the moment that we're in Latin America. And then there's the other issues around the quality of the delivery of public goods. And here I'm talking about education, I'm talking about access to healthcare. And all of these things came late because of the very reasons that we had this kind of shock of accelerated urbanization. And that, to me, when I always, especially thinking of Asia, which is in this big push, as Takehiko mentioned, is still 50% of the population in rural areas, there's a lot to be learned from the Latin American experience on what not to do. And equally, we have other things that we can learn across each other, and that's the magic of this report.
Wonderful. Thank you, President Moreno. President Chakrabarti, I wanted to ask, you work in different regions as well, so I was wondering, you know, how do urbanization trends in EBRD countries differ from those in other emerging economies?
Well, thank you, Tatiana, and I'm delighted to be here. I mean, thank you very much, Luis Alberto, for inviting all of us yet again to IADB. It's always nice to be at this end of the town, I must say, during these 2 weeks we spend in Washington. And it's nice to be with my RDB colleagues, particularly. I must also say a big thank you to all of those who worked on this report across our 4 RDBs. And I have to say, I think the Future of Work, the report last year was great. This is a fantastic report. I think we should keep this cycle going. It's really good to compare what's happening in our regions. I also should say, because as a former development economist, I'm really glad this subject is back. This was a subject in the Industrial Revolution. It was a subject for the 60s and 70s, and the Harris-Tadaro model and all that. And then it sort of got lost, and it's now come back in a big way, and it's important for all of us. So one pledge, I hope, is that we keep this going. Our region, the EBRD region, is very interesting, and the city as a unit is very interesting. If you go back to the history of EBRD, in 1991 we were created really to move the former communist bloc towards market economies, and part of the fundamental objective really was to break the power of the central state, and therefore to move power to cities as much as possible, away from the center. So this has been a big thing for us since our creation, and some of my colleagues who've worked on this for many years are here as well. And that's why we have a huge portfolio in the city space as well, municipal services space. But you're right, our region is rather more interesting in some ways because it's a real mix. It's a very heterogeneous region. We now invest from Morocco to Mongolia, Estonia to Egypt. So 3 continents, but high heterogeneity in terms of countries of operations. We have in Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey, countries which are much earlier, at the earlier stage of demographic transition. And that, by the way, demographics has come back as an issue as well, which is quite good as well, I think, as a development issue. We have large, growing young populations in those countries, and therefore we have similarities here with the issues that people put, my colleagues put here. You see very high rates of population growth in the bigger cities in those regions, whether it's, I've been visiting Nur Sultan, as we now call it, Astana as it was, for 7.5, 8 years. It's doubled in size during this time I've been president of EBRD. Cairo, every time I go to Cairo, I see yet another new suburb. I mean, I've lost count of what's happened to that city. Tunis, similarly, Nile Delta as well. And with the refugee population as well, in some of these areas like in Jordan, you're also seeing huge growth in cities. Now, the contrast. If you go to emerging Europe, Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, Baltics, Caucasus, you're seeing an aging population, which is actually pretty much the same pattern of aging you get in Western Europe. You're having much lower birth rates, life expectancy rising, and you have quite a lot of outward migration, but unlike Western Europe, with very little inward migration, because they've taken a policy, particularly in Eastern Europe, not to encourage that. So what you're seeing there is increasingly the capital cities are growing, the Warsaws, the Tbilisis, and others are all growing, but you're seeing depopulation in the secondary cities. And it's remarkable if you go to some of these countries, how little is going on, how lack of vibrancy almost in some of the secondary cities as people are depopulating them. And that is a big issue for us, actually, about what do we do in this situation. It's a different sort of set of issues than we face, which are common in the other countries we talked about. Frankly, in some of these places, it reminds me of my youth. I first went to Detroit in 1978. I was 19 years old, a lover of Tamla Motown music, only to find that Tamla Motown had moved to LA, and several of the car industries were beginning to close down. The center of Detroit was a desert by then, and of course they've been trying ever since to revive Detroit, and that is what you're seeing in some of the emerging Europe countries. And it's a real concern, actually, because ideas for how to revive them if you have an anti-migration policy is quite difficult, actually, and difficult generally for the economy. But that's one of the things we're struggling with in those countries. In the other countries that I talked about, there are great similarities in terms of what we're trying to do.
Thank you, President Chakravarti. President Adesina, I wanted to ask you, how are the high 5 priorities of the African Development Bank addressing the trends that you shared with us?
No, thanks. We have 5 priorities as a bank, and the first one is to light up and empower Africa. The second one is to feed Africa. The third is to integrate Africa, and the fourth is to industrialize Africa. And the fifth is to improve the quality of life of the people of Africa. So if I start with the first one, which has to do with electricity. And so you take a look at Africa today, where Africa has close to 600 million people that don't have access to electricity. A lot of those are in the rural areas, also those that are in the urban areas. And so we are investing over the 5-year period, about $15 billion in the energy sector. And we are looking at, we're working on grid-based systems, mini grid-based systems, and off-grid systems to provide electricity. In the last 4 years alone, our support has helped to connect 16 million people to electricity. But if I look at some of the areas where it's actually much more difficult, let's speak, for example, the Sahelian countries. Mm-hmm. When I was doing my master's degree at Purdue University in research in 1983, I did it in Niger Republic. I lived in a place called Maradi. And at that time, the rural access rate to electricity was 0%, zero, completely zero. I went back to Niger just recently, and I was told that the rural access rate was 0.8%. And we were talking to one of the ministers who said, well, you know, we want to make this to be about 10%, 15%. I was fortunate to be there with the president. And I said, no, Mr. President, I disagree with him because the only thing I can accept is 100%. I say that because vast areas of the Sahel, the point you were raising about migration, Suma, that is emptying itself to Europe and so on. They're doing that because those rural areas are literally areas of misery. There are no jobs, there's no electricity, you can't watch television, you can't do anything. And also happens to be areas that have the highest fertility rate. You know, Niger has fertility rate of 7.2, right? And so there's a high correlation between not having electricity and high birth rates. You know, that's just the way it is. You know, people have to be busy doing something, you know. And so what we've decided to do in the Sahel is we are supporting right now what we call Desert to Power. It's a big initiative to help to support the construction and development of 10,000 megawatts of power all across the Sahelian countries. And that will provide electricity for 250 million people. And 90 million of that will be via off-grid systems. So these will be largely in the cities, in also the rural areas, so you can reduce, as you said, that rural migration into the urban areas. And also, even worse, those that will come, as Luis was saying, come land in the urban areas, and then they can't find anything, then go to Europe, get on some rickety boats and head towards Europe. So that's helping on that. On agriculture, we're investing about $25 billion over 10 years to support agriculture as a business. And I want to support what President Nakao was saying, because when we develop rural economies as zones of economic prosperity, you're not going to have the kind of migration you're having today. And so what happens in Africa is that we're taking agriculture as a way of life, right? And so we're helping right now to change that to agriculture as a business, as a wealth-creating sector. So we're investing in what's called special agro-industrial processing zones. Essentially, is to invest in massive infrastructure, water, roads, electricity, irrigation, ICT, and create these zones in which you can transpose the food and ag industry into those areas, because in Africa today, the food and ag industries are not in the rural areas. They're in the urban areas, always close to the port. There are no farms close to the port. The only reason they're there is because there's no infrastructure density to allow them to do that. So we're investing heavily in that, and we believe that when that happens, they'll be closer to the farmers will have markets, you will reduce rural to urban drift, you will create a lot of wealth. If Luis was mentioning about the issue of fiscal space in rural areas will expand. So that's one of the things that we are doing. And when it comes to regional integration, I'll talk only about the continental free trade area and what that means. Because if we right now we have an African continental free trade area, that's, you know, a tariff-free zone that's about $3.3 trillion that you're talking about. But if we do not address these inequalities in urban rural areas, what's going to happen is you will have a lot of people moving across borders, right, looking for jobs, and they can't find jobs. It becomes a problem. So we are investing heavily in infrastructure, transnational highways. We're investing in ICT infrastructure for connectivity. We're also investing in trade finance to support small and medium-sized enterprises who can trade across borders. And just not to take much time, I want to just end on the issue of skills for young people. Because as we talk of cities, you know, I went to one of the cities that will remain nameless because of the experience that I had there. And I got over there, and I just saw young people littering the streets, literally on drugs. And they can't find jobs. They are in the urban areas, and crime rate is going up because of that. So I think as a bank, we are investing in what do we have to do. And later today, we're going to be talking at our meetings about our work on jobs to upgrade skills, to create finance, to create inclusive finance so that women and youth can have access to finance. Small and medium-sized enterprises can thrive. If you go to Lagos or if you go to Abidjan, you go to Cairo, that you were mentioning, you just find small and medium-sized enterprises everywhere. Everybody's trying to make a living, but they don't have access to finance. So we've got to make sure as part of what we're doing that we are providing access to finance for the small, medium-sized enterprises to create the jobs that we need. Because if we do not turn the consumer expenditure in the cities to grow the cities, those cities will just not be areas of prosperity. And for us in Africa, we look at the numbers and we say to ourselves, well, 2015, size of all the consumer expenditures in all these cities, $1.4 trillion. 2035, we're $2.1 trillion. But how do you make that happen? You need infrastructure, you need skills, you need jobs, and people must also finally not have to travel far from where their homes are in cities. So we've got to really do a lot more on urban planning, and quite honestly, it's an area that we're willing to learn from others. How do we plan better? It's not just about where people live, where do they work? And how do you have social services that will allow them to have quality of life in the city? So these are some of the things that we're trying to do.
Thank you, President Sina. President Nakao, Strategy 2030 of the Asian Development Bank identifies livable cities as one of its 7 main pillars. What are the most effective policies that the Asian Development Bank is promoting?
Yeah, as you mentioned, when we plan the Strategy 2030, we try to take approach of an integrated approach instead of sector by sector like water or transport and energy. So 5 priority areas is, in addition to governance and regional cooperation, those are kind of thematic, but 5 priorities, persistent poverty, and the second is gender equality, and third is climate change, and the fourth is rural development, and the fifth is livable cities. So we try to approach these issues from integrated solutions, and livable city is one of them. So what is a livable city? So when I hear the discussions, there are too many kind of issues to tackle, so I'm becoming a little bit daunted. I feel that there are so many challenges, but in the Asian context, at least we must once again face the issues of congestions and traffic. Public transport is important. In many cities in Asia, there were less investment in the public works and public transportation, like Manila. In 1960s and 70s, the idea was how to use a road and how to motorize the cities. Maybe there was an influence from American kind of ideas, but there was less investment in public transport. But we are now investing in the railroad and the bus transit, and also finally subway in Manila is being constructed. In most of Asian cities, metros or subways are becoming a very important investment. In India, there are so many investment in subways in Mumbai, Delhi, and Kolkata. Medium-sized urban areas are becoming also the places for subway investment. In China, there are so many cities which now have a subway. So transport is so important, and also the cleaner transport system is key, and the integrated system to combine subway and the bus and the railways and so on. And also water is important, and in case of Asia, many water systems are from colonial days, and they are already very old. And often the non-revenue water is more than 50% of the water supply. So they cannot collect enough tariff so that they can invest in the better system. So we must change this vicious circle of the non-revenue water. So in case of Dhaka, we are supporting Dhaka water and sewage, including the such management system like district management, so that we can identify the leakage and the stealing of the water more quickly and with the meters and once again district system. And it is amazing that they reduced the non-revenue water portion from about 50% to about several percent. 90% of water is now revenue water, which means leakage and stealing and so on is only several percent. And why could we do that? It is, of course, technology like metering and district, but also the Dhaka water and sewage system involve the community and how to collect the tariff. And instead of paying to the broker of stealing water, they realize that the paying to the utility is even cheaper and getting better drinkable water. So in a sense, water is important, but we need to include the element of the community and the institutions. And in addition, once again, gender is a very important element of Asian Development Bank strategy. Financing, SME finance focused on the women is important in the cities and also in rural areas. And also the technical and vocational education for women is important. But in urban areas, what we try to do is to include the element of the facilities good for women as a part of infrastructure development. So in any urban project, we try to include the element of the support for women, like the facilities for women, or including women's perspective to design the project and so on. So that is another, I think we pay attention there. And another point is about disaster resilience. Many Asian cities are more vulnerable to susceptible to the disasters. And we saw the flooding in Tokyo just 1 week ago. And even if we have a very good levees in the river, the waterfall is now rainfall is becoming unexpected kind of amount. And so in that regard, of course, to prepare the good infrastructure is important. How to make a leeway for the waters when the rainfall is very heavy. At the same time, softer kind of approach in which evacuation can be warned earlier than too late. So that kind of element is also important. So there are so many things we must tackle, but I think the Asian cities are now becoming paying more attention to these areas, including how to involve communities, how to have a better urban planning with the integrated approach.
Thank you, President Nakao. President Moreno, the cities in Latin America and the Caribbean are really striving to advance social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and productivity. What are some of the most important policies that the Inter-American Development Bank is promoting?
Well, first of all, you are actually the one that articulates this, so I'm just going to repeat whatever you would say. Look, when you talk about livable cities, it's a lot of what my colleagues have spoken here, is affordable housing. And, the bank has been doing a lot in that regard. We've done a lot of analytical work in this space. Actually, one of our principal research projects that we do every year precisely pointed to the fact of the lack of access to low-income housing or housing in general, but especially low-income. And, that is a function of densities in cities in terms of being able to put pressure on lowering the cost of land, and especially land with public services, because otherwise, as cities extend, the cost of bringing public services to extreme size of a city, and then the challenges that come thereby on mobility are tremendous. And unfortunately, this is the one lesson that one always has to have from the more developed countries in how cities develop, how the densities in those cities are different. In terms of the whole question of urban services, for instance, in the question of public spaces, this again, when you have these huge pockets of poverty, all of a sudden you find yourself that you lost the public spaces. And so making, the parks, the trees, these are some of the things that unfortunately get dealt with later, but are critical for making cities that are livable and productive. Something that Keiko mentioned, and to your question, the whole question of resilience, especially in areas that are, take today the case of either Central American or Caribbean countries, which are exposed to tremendous amounts of natural disasters. Building resilience before and after is a critical thing. We, for purpose of my colleagues, we developed this program that we call Emerging Cities because we had a clear understanding that we didn't want to see more and more throughout Latin America what happened in the major cities where you have these pockets of poverty and all of this disruption, and is to think, where are the cities that are gonna double in size in the next 20 years? We basically began to have a whole system of indicators that we developed and looking that, you can have the kind of planning around that, and I'm glad to see that a lot of that experience has been taken to other parts, to other regions of the world. But clearly, our financing is going to always be around areas of mobility. This can be either public or private, as I said earlier, in terms of housing. And the housing is a very important part of what it means specifically around jobs and the improvement of living standards. And here is actually a very good story of what you've seen in Latin America over the years. And the better housing and affordable housing you have, the more you broaden the tax base for cities to reinvest in delivering on their public goods that they need to deliver. And then there's another dimension which I feel very proud of the work that the bank has done, which is not a good story, but it comes with these cases of development, which is the citizen security. And the tragedy in Latin America is that if you look back at the 80s, we had what we called then the lost decade. Countries were not growing, or the contrary, some were contracting, and yet the crime rates in those years were far lower than they are today, or have been in the last 10 or 15 years. And that's also an important part of what needs to happen in cities, is addressing the security issues. Many times it means not only increasing the amount of police force, but equally how they organize, how they interact with citizens. And these are the kinds of things in terms of livable cities that you need. And now a new phenomenon that's happening, and I think that's something that we all are seeing in one way or the other through our institutions, is this mass migration that we're seeing in the case of Latin America. Is largely coming out of Venezuela, but it's not just there. And that puts a tremendous burden on cities in how to deal and to incorporate and make this into a positive as opposed to a negative. It is initially a negative shock, but if administered right, it can be a positive shock if you are able to deliver the kinds of public goods that incorporate these people into the economy, where you can have the possibility of providing healthcare, education, housing, even reskilling. These are the areas where we equally are working as well.
Right. Thank you, President Moreno. President Chakravarti, I wanted to ask you, how do you see, might the private sector contribute to leveraging opportunities in cities, and specifically in EBRD, where there is quite a lot of private sector working going on? How is this happening?
So it's a really good question. I mean, in the case of EBRD, I already, I think, in a way, explained why we have such a large urban portfolio. We have, for ideological reasons of 1991, wanted to break the power of central planning, so cities were very big for us. So we've invested, I think, in something like 220 cities, nearly 500 projects now, over 8 billion euros, in a whole range of the same sort of urban infrastructure and services you've heard about, water, wastewater, solid waste management, public transport, roads and energy efficiency, all of those things. But the fundamental second part of this is exactly as you said, Tatiana. Because of our focus, what we've been trying to do with these cities is try to get a more private sector mentality. And I use the word mentality because we want ultimately to have more private sector participation. But we realize often to persuade people to move in that direction, you want to start having commercial practices and so on early on, and then moving towards that private sector participation in the provision of public services. A lot of thought in this was actually given in the World Bank in the late 80s by people like Roth and others, and that has come through in our work very strongly. I think we have three types of interventions, and I'll mention a fourth one which is coming through, which is, I think, again, we've learned from each other a lot on this. The first is, won't surprise you, it's the sort of financial investments. What sort of investments should we do? And here, for us, given our private sector focus, yes, some of those investments will be at sovereign level, for sure. But the ones I'm happiest about and want to chair, particularly in terms of EBRD's business model, is working at sub-sovereign level directly with the municipalities or with municipal utilities, more and more often without sovereign guarantee. Because the whole purpose is the municipality learns for itself. It doesn't have this backstop of the state bailing it out. It therefore has to think about how it's going to be effective and efficient and actually get a sound investment. And we're doing more and more of that. We, of course, need blended finance for this. So you often have rather well-targeted concessional financing as well, some grant funding. And we try to innovate to really tailor for each city's circumstance. So that's a financial investment space. But the second part of this, I think, has to be the policy space for us. And, if we're developing a sort of Green City Action Plan, for example, we want to make sure that the city is really committed to the sorts of investments and policy framework that will make and for environmental sustainability. We also want them to think about tariff reform. Now, we're not, although we're a private sector development-focused bank in 1991, we're not slaves to the market principle completely. We want them to move towards cost recovery, but we want to care about affordability and accessibility as well in doing so. So we will try and think about that in the sort of trajectory of tariff reform, working with these cities. And it's very important in that dialogue with municipalities, with mayors and others, to remind them, we don't have a political role, but to remind them there's politics in this. Of course, tariff reform is never popular, but cutting costs of public services for the consumer is popular. And particularly older people, they vote. And if their energy bills are coming down because of these investments, that's helpful. So sort of voce type of encouragement to think about this in political terms and political economy terms is always helpful as part of this. We also think about public service contracts to try and assign the right roles between municipalities, utilities, and the private sector as well. The third part of this is technical assistance, and this is a bit of a back to the future for all of us, because I had thought by now, in many of the countries we work in, that the capability at municipal level would be sufficiently good that project preparation would be much easier than it is. Yes, it is in some cities, some of the more advanced cities in Eastern Europe, yes, but in many of the other cities, secondary cities there, but also in other places, it isn't. And so we've had to put, I think all four institutions, put in money into project preparation now at urban level. And that's been very necessary to help implement projects as well as create them, to also try and get operational improvements, and also for implementation of these projects too. Now, the thing that I wanted to particularly mention in terms of our new development, I think, is the focus on green cities, green city action plans. This has been the most popular thing amongst our shareholders I have seen in my 7.5 years there. They rarely miss a chance to say, well, we're not so sure we want to give you any more money for this or that. Unbelievable. We've had a 700 million euro extension the other day, doubling what we're doing already, in the Green Cities framework, because this has become a really popular product. And they can see that mayors come to EBRD and talk so positively of the changes it brought in their cities. For this, you have to have a commitment. You have to be a green city that's really willing to go the extra mile to create the right sort of plans and work with us on this. And then you have to have implementation capacity as well, executing capacity, as I would call it. A great example of this for me is Tbilisi. Tbilisi is a growing city. A lot of the secondary cities, people coming in, and it was mentioned in the report, actually, in the RDB report, I think. We invested, first of all, in 143 new buses. Have a nice EBRD logo in the back with each bus, which I like. But the really interesting thing is it reduced emissions in the city. 85% of the emissions in that city were caused by the previous buses. So what a wonderful reduction in emissions because of this investment and because of that mayor in that city, really. They did other things as well in other areas, but this was a massive success. We now have, I think, is it 100 odd green cities now? 33, but we're going to 100. Yeah, we're going to 100 by 2025. I mean, my worry is actually we haven't got enough money for the demand, but I'm going to go back to the shareholders and say, look, this has been a real success. And I think this would not have been developed without working across regional banks. So when we developed this, we actually asked all the other RDBs, what have you done to try and have green frameworks in the cities? And we took this sort of approach whereby we would not invest until you actually come up with a plan, and then we combine it with the first investment. It's fantastic. And the next stage, of course, is the smart cities, as you all mentioned. I mean, technology, completely right, I think, Takahiko, that's got to be the next stage. And here, many of our cities are looking to, in our case, particularly Central Asia to East Asia. So we have a lot of these study trips now to Singapore, to Taiwan, and other places to actually learn how to take technology into urban planning and urban infrastructure services. So it's wonderful. I mean, I think this is a great move forward, but we need to build further on it. And it's an area, I think, where we can do more together as well going forward. I think particularly for us with Asian Development Bank in Central Asia, I expect to do more co-financing in this area as well.
Great. I'm very aware that we've taken a little bit more time, but I wanted to ask you a very last question. And it's relating to what you highlighted in terms of, collaboration among RDBs. President Desina, what would be your recommendation for better collaboration amongst our institutions?
Well, I think even the fact that we all got together to write this report, it's already a learning opportunity and a sharing opportunity, because I think the issues are not so much the challenges. The report is quite comprehensive, and from this discussion, we know what those challenges are. It's really how we share information. I think that's particularly important, and how we, especially lessons from those that have already faced bigger challenges, like you were saying, Luis, in Latin America. It's not a model that you want to transfer. But also the other thing is diagnostics tools to be able to plan cities better. We're working with you now, I think, to learn from some of those diagnostics tools that we can use as we plan our cities together. But just since we're looking for ways in which we can actually work more closely together, I would like to propose to my colleagues that we look at some kind of a joint action plan on how we actually plan for resilient cities, because the cities are going to be the hub of making things happen. I think we all have in different approaches that we are using, but some kind of a real collective effort of how we put our resources, learning experiences together to build more resilient cities in a modernizing world. I think it will be a very useful thing to have.
President Moreno, what do you think are some of the topics that are more relevant and maybe in view for possible collaboration?
Well, look, I think the interesting thing about cities and this discussion that we have is our lending over time, especially for a bank like ours that basically deals in middle-income countries, is going to be more and more around what you do in state and local governments. And it's only natural that can happen both through sovereign or non-sovereign lending. But the other issue is, in this complex political environment that we live around the world, it is at the local level where things get more done and where good experiences travel faster. And our capacity to crowd in collectively, as perhaps is the idea that I understand Aki is putting, where we can quickly learn from all the different regions of the world on good practices that are taking place, and then turning that through our collective teams, I think to me is the most valuable thing. And this is what I really like about this exercise. We learned a lot about it. last year with on the future of jobs. I think these questions of migration. I mean, there's all these new challenges out there that we have a very unique approach, learning across each other, and because we're not in everybody's backyard the way the World Bank is, it's easier to learn.
Great. Thank you, President Moreno. President Chakrabarti, you mentioned the case of green cities as one where there had been exchange of knowledge, exchange of lessons. What would be the main recommendations for other topics like this?
So we're also doing, I think, a really interesting learning series on megatrends in livable cities, and there we're trying to bring in experiences in other regions as well as our own, including also developed countries. So, Sadiq Khan and people like that in London as well. I actually think there's also a need on the ground in the countries of operation that are common to us, to do more stuff together around cities, particularly amongst our teams. But if there's one thing I want to see, which we're very shy about talking about in the international development community, it's about leadership, and it's about leadership at mayoral level. We know there are a bunch of mayors who are particularly, wonderful, go-ahead, younger generation trying to change. Actually, not all younger generation. The great mayor of Amman municipality, who's pretty elderly, but fantastic as well. These are people who are often having to take on vested interests in order to deliver the changes, and they need our support. They're also much more open, I find, about talking about successes as well as failures. And I would like to see more of those events where we actually try to showcase what they've done and build them up. Leadership is almost a dirty word generally in institutions like ours, but actually it's fundamental to making the changes we want to see at urban level and in other areas too. So more of this, and I would love to organize some seminars where we bring mayors from other regions together with ours in our region.
We're already doing that with some, but we're happy to integrate.
Great.
Great. Thank you, President Chakrabarti. President Nakao, this publication, so wonderful that we have presented today, was led by the Asian Development Bank in this case. Any reflections on how we may work knowledge subjects together better?
Yeah, thank you very much. I should have mentioned this first, but I really appreciate the co-work of the team to produce this interesting and useful paper or book. And we can learn from each other a lot. And there are so many different issues. And for instance, from Mr. Moreno's point, I'm reminded that the issues in urban areas are a little bit different. You mentioned a lot about housing and also migrations and also the crime issues. Of course, these are also relevant to Asian urban issues, but we are more concerned about pollutions and congestions and so on. So there is a little bit different kind of focus, but we can learn from difference. But also there are so many common issues as we discussed, the institutions and the communities and agendas and so on, and or disaster resilience. So compared to the discussion in the G20, these discussions are more closer to the ground of the regions or developing countries like us. And so what they are discussing in the G20 is what is continued the conditions of uncertainties and lower growth. It is relevant to us, but our perspective is a little bit different. And so there are many things we can continue to research. And for instance, like the opportunity for agriculture again, and nutritious, delicious, more high-valued agriculture can be one possibility. And for instance, Georgia is an interesting place for wines and agriculture products. So when we become richer in terms of watches and cars and so on, we pay more attention to, once again, the delicious, nutritious, safer food. And also another possibility is tourism. Because if we have more robotics and AI, there are more time to enjoy. And what can we do? And to see things or to exchange of views with others, kind of empathy through the tourism can be another interesting activity, and which can be a good topic. And education and health in middle-income countries, or what kind of education is possible to prepare for the future. So technology has two facets in education. One is how we must be prepared, how we can prepare for the future technologies through education. Maybe there is no clear answer, but what can we do? And another element is how we can use the technology for education. So the same to maybe health, how we can use technology, that is another possibility. So there are many areas we can have a common approach or discussion together, and I hope that this will continue to last. By the way, except Mr. All of us will leave. So you'll seek another term. But we'll leave. But I hope these traditions of doing things together and learning each other will continue forever.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you, President.